When I was pregnant for the first time, I attended a parenting class. And at that class, the instructor asked, "Is there anyone here who thinks she can write the great American novel on her maternity leave?" Well, I giggled to myself because, you see, I had already convinced my father-in-law that we should take my maternity leave from CNN to write this book. I mean, I was in charge of research for CNN's national desk and figured we could knock it out quickly. I mean, the baby would be sleeping or cooing blissfully most of the time, so we'd have so much time to write it, right? Obviously, I knew nothing about babies or about the complexities of dragging out memory after 50 years. So instead of 3 months, writing this book took us over 6 years. Now, my late father-in-law, Bert Lewyn, or Dagobert Lewyn, as he was known in Germany, had such an unusual Holocaust survival story. He was never in a concentration camp, or so we think. Late breaking news about that coming up. He was not hidden in one place like Anne Frank. He was in Berlin the entire war, present at every major event, from the famous book burning that he attended when he was only 10 to Kristallnacht when he was 15. He lived through the Allied bombings and the Russian army invasion. He saw the aftermath of the war both in Berlin and in the displaced persons camp. Dagobert was born in 1923 to Leopold and Johanna Lewyn, Jewish parents who had both been sent to Berlin as teenagers so they could attend a Jewish high school for the deaf and hard of hearing. Dagobert was their beloved only child. When Hitler forbade Jewish children from attending public school, his parents sent Dagobert to live in a Jewish orphanage in Berlin because that orphanage's school was one of the only places where a Jewish child could continue their education. When he was in high school, Dagobert did a metalworking apprenticeship where he learned how to build machines. And this, again, was one of the very few ways that a Jewish boy could continue his studies. And those skills would later save his life. When he was 18, his world turned much darker. The Gestapo deported his parents to their deaths. But they kept Dagobert in Berlin to be used as slave labor, making machine guns for the Nazi war effort. One morning, while heading into work, Dagobert just happened to bump into a non-Jewish man who he knew who worked in the same gun factory. And that man warned Dagobert not to go into work that day because the Gestapo were loading all of the Jews who arrived at the factory onto trucks. And so with that miraculous tip, Dagobert tore off the yellow Jewish star on his coat and he went underground, becoming a U-boat, a Jew living illegally and fighting to stay undetected. Dagobert roamed the streets of Berlin. Though he was just a teenager, he did crazy things to survive, like live in the rubble of bombed-out buildings, pose as SS, uniform and all. He stole a Gestapo ID card and had it forged to look like him. He stole a Gestapo car in the vain hopes of fleeing to Switzerland. And he lived in the forest, eating pigeons to try to stay alive. When the Gestapo finally captured him, they mistook him for a British spy, and so instead of sending him off to a concentration camp, they threw him into a Berlin prison where they tortured and interrogated him. The Allies later bombed that prison courtyard, and so the Gestapo put the Jews to work to clean it up. In the rubble, Dagobert found a piece of lead pipe, And he took that pipe and a file, and he made a key, and he unlocked the prison gate and escaped. Terribly weak from starvation and torture, Dagobert literally walked across bombed-out Berlin through the rubble to the apartment of Jewish friends of his whom he prayed would still be alive and be able to take him in. This Jewish family lived in the basement apartment of a Nazi district headquarters building. Why did they live there? Because the mother worked as a housekeeper for the Nazi offices upstairs, and they gave her an apartment as part of her pay. They had no idea she was Jewish or that she was hiding her family in that apartment. So after a day and a half of walking through the rubble, Dagobert finally arrived at the apartment. The mother of this family answered the door, and Dagobert immediately collapsed into her arms. The family pulled him in, and he lay unconscious for days on their couch. Once he woke up, the Russian army could be heard invading Berlin. Now, the Russians were beyond angry, eager to take revenge on as many Nazis as they could. So they were basically going from house to house looking for Nazis to rape and kill. So when the Russian soldiers finally arrive at this Nazi district headquarters building, they assumed they would be finding Nazis to kill. And so they kicked down the door of the family's basement apartment. Dagobert and the family jumped up, hands up, and Dagobert somehow had the presence of mind to call out, "Stop! Don't shoot! We're Jews!" One of the Russian soldiers yelled back in a strange German-like language, "You're liars. All the Jews are dead." And Dagobert exclaimed, "But I can prove it. I have an uncle in Moscow who's Jewish." "Oh yeah? What's his name?" Now, Dagobert had only met this uncle once when he was a little boy, and the uncle came to Berlin to visit his family. But he remembered the name, Boris Lewyn. "Oh yeah? What does he do?" And Dagobert racked his brain again to try to remember. But miraculously, he recalled overhearing a conversation between his dad and his uncle. "My uncle is an electrical engineer." And with that, the Russian soldier put down his gun. "I believe you. I am an electrician, and in school I studied from a book written by Boris Lewyn." The Russian soldier told his comrades to put down their guns, and he gave Dagobert and the Jewish family passes so they could move safely about Berlin. Now, what are the chances that of all the Russian soldiers who could have blasted down the door of that apartment, that one would be Jewish, speak Yiddish, and therefore be able to communicate with them? And what are the chances that he would be an electrician who used a book written by Dagobert's father and then would believe them? It's miraculous, right? So this book reads like a novel with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But at the beginning, it was nothing like that. Only once had my father-in-law spoken about what happened to him during the war, and that was way back in 1980 when his cousin, a renowned Holocaust historian, had basically forced Bert to sit down and record on cassette. Remember what those were, cassettes? What he remembered of his time during the war. And what my father-in-law remembered were primarily three main stories, or miracles, as I thought of them. And so we began with the information on those tapes. And I interviewed Bert about those memories and then tried to extricate more from his mind. I asked him questions about broader topics: his childhood, his family, their values and outlook. What did hunger feel like? How did you get food? And all of this, I got down on computer, verbatim, in his own words. Now, while many Holocaust survivors have a difficult time talking about their stories, Bert was extraordinary in that he never got emotional or broke down. He was always able to handle my relentless questioning, no matter how painful the topic. And so in the end, we had many more stories and much more detail. But as incredible as the breadth of our material now was, they were stories without context. He remembered a story here and a story there and a story here, but there was no before and no after. And so we had to create a timeline, and this process took months. Now, some dates we knew for certain from our hard research. Let's draw our imaginary timeline. We knew the date of his parents' deportation was March 26, 1942. We knew that February 27, 1943 was the date of the factory action, the day when he would have been tipped off and then would have gone into hiding. And then we knew that late April to May of 1945 was when the Russians entered Berlin, and this would have been close to the time when he would have escaped from prison and gotten to that Jewish family's home. But in between, we had 3 years to fill, and we wanted to define those days as accurately as possible. And so we went back to questioning. I took him back to his memories, now trying to place them on our timeline. For example, I asked him, "Remember when you worked in the car repair shop with the Jehovah's Witnesses? Do you remember feeling cold or hot?" Well, he remembered feeling cold, and so we slotted that memory as winter. But which winter? Would it have been early in your U-boat years, middle, late? So once we had the stories on the timeline, that then exposed some gaps, which we could then attack. For example, the lovely Catholic couple, the Kozitskis, hid you, but how did you meet them? Now he remembered another person and more details. So you see, one question led to another, which led to more information and more questions, and so on. And as we gathered new information, either from his memory or from the books and documents that we researched, we would update our timeline. Finally, it was time to take his dry, factual memories and write the book. So taking our timeline and his verbatim, I would now write the chapters, always with Bert sitting by my side. I'd now ask him for specific descriptions. You're at the subway stop near the blind communist's house. Walk me to his apartment. Is it a residential neighborhood or is it industrial? Is it wealthy, middle class? Are there leaves on the trees? Okay, you get to his apartment door and he opens it. What does he look like? What is he wearing? What might he have said to you and how would he have sent it? Very frequently, I would stop my writing and have him critique it. Sometimes he'd correct me, saying I had made him seem too emotional or the like. And so I would always revise it. We were always so concerned with accuracy. Now, over the years of ferocious questioning and digging, there were some major discoveries. The blockbuster of them all came when one day, after Bert remembered hanging on to the top of a moving train to hide from the police, I just stopped and turned to him and said, "Your story is completely amazing. It's like an action film straight out of Hollywood. But there's only one problem. Hollywood's going to want a love story, and it's a pity you don't have one." Well, we both got a great laugh out of that. But the next time we met, Bert told me that my joke had jarred something in his memory. He now remembered a pretty red-haired Jewish nurse named Ilza. He recalled meeting her at her aunt's Berlin home, losing his virginity to her, and then posing as husband and wife for about 6 weeks while they hid in a drunkard's apartment. Then he remembered nothing about her until the end of the war, when they discovered that they had both survived and they met again in Ilse's displaced persons camp. Bert recalled that his rabbi had urged him to get a Jewish divorce, a get, just in case anyone should have thought you were really married. And after the Jewish divorce, Bert recalled that Ilse married a British soldier and went to live in England. And that was it. That was all he remembered. And so we promptly added this story of Ilse to the book and went on. But then new questions and contradictions arose. Bert came across a letter that he had kept from the nice Catholic lady who had hidden him. In the letter, she reported that Ilse and Ilse's son Klaus had come to visit her outside of Berlin, decades after the war. Now, this made no sense. How would Ilse have even known her, much less known her well enough to travel across the continent to pay a visit so many years after the war? Months later, after Bert requested some documents from a Berlin government archive, the German archivist sent Bert the information about Bert's parents that he had requested, but he also sent Bert some documents about your wife, Ilse Pearl Lewyn. Wife? Ilse Pearl Lewyn? How in the world would the German government have listed her as Bert's wife? Remember, his memory was that they had merely been posing as husband and wife. So we had to get down to the bottom of this. And so we did an international search for Ilse. Since the Catholic lady's letter mentioned that Ilse was married to an orthopedist, we put ads searching for Ilse in the British Orthopedic Journal. Bert also placed notices in the newsletters commonly read by Holocaust survivors. Then Bert read a German-language book that mentioned Ilse. So he contacted the author, who directed Bert to Ilse's friend, a Mrs. Fink in Chicago. Bert called Mrs. Fink and began to ask her about Ilse. But Mrs. Fink quickly said, No, I can't talk to you. Undeterred, Bert decided to send Mrs. Fink a letter and to include in that letter a list of questions he had for Ilse. He left the questions for Ilse unsealed so that Mrs. Fink could easily read them and see that he meant no harm. He just wanted Ilse's help to answer some of his questions. And then we waited and waited. And after waiting 6 months, we decided we couldn't wait any longer. We would just have to finish writing the book as best we could, in spite of the great mystery. And then, after we finished writing our major draft of the book, it happened. The telephone rang, and my mother-in-law, Esther, answered it, and a voice said, "This is Ilse." Well, my mother-in-law was so stunned, she nearly dropped the phone. But she managed to run it to my father-in-law. Ilse told Bert that she had known for 6 months that he had been searching for her, but she hadn't wanted to contact him. Finally, her curiosity got the best of her. Ilse told him, "It seems as if you've forgotten a lot. Do you want to know the bad as well as the good?" "Yes," he responded. "I want to know everything." And what Ilse told Bert was shocking. She told him that they had not merely been posing as husband and wife. Instead, They had been legally wed in a German court of law, and she had the paperwork to prove it. Ilse informed Bert that she had been with him during many of his U-boat experiences, and she proved that by sharing many of the details that Bert remembered, but she could add more. You see, many of the memories that Bert had, Ilse had, but Bert had forgotten her presence. Most shocking, she told him that they had had a child together, a baby boy who lived only a few months and died at Bergen-Belsen. But Bert had zero memory of losing a son. Now, part of my research was speaking to a trauma specialist to try to understand how trauma survivors can push painful memories so far away they no longer recall them at all. It was explained to me that it's like they have a house full of terrible memories, but to cope and move forward, instead of burning down the house, they just throw away the key. Ilse, his first wife, was Bert's key. And so, once we caught our breath, we went back and rewrote the book, inserting Ilse's presence. And so, in the end, we're left with not one, but two remarkable stories. First, the story of a very brave and clever young man who outwitted the Nazis right on their home turf. And second, the story of that same man rediscovering his history for himself, for his family, and for you. Okay, so I want to show you some of the photos we have, and I'll give you an update on my research, and then I'll take questions. So, alrighty. So this is a copy of the latest edition of the book that was just published in March of 2019. And I was very fortunate to be able to finish the book tour literally the week before COVID shut the world down. This is a picture of Bert's parents, Johanna and Leopold, probably taken on their wedding day. And this is a picture of Dagobert on his very first day of school. He's likely 6. And he's standing with what's called a Zucker hut, which is a tradition that goes on till today in Germany, where on your first day of school, the parents give this cone full of candy in hopes that your learning will be sweet. And I've always loved this because, of course, we Jews have a similar tradition that when a child starts learning the Aleph base, we always give them honey or something sweet for the same purpose. This is the only picture we have of Dagobert when he would have been, sort of a preteen teen. He's likely 13. This is taken in the orphanage courtyard. Dagobert is on the right, and these are his 2 best buddies from the orphanage. And the buddy on the left, his name at the time was Lothar Baruch. He actually was able to leave on the very first Kindertransport to England and eventually grew up, changed his name to Leslie Brent, and went on to become part of the team that won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1960. If you know anyone who's ever had an organ transplant, he actually discovered one of the key things that allows us to actually give organ transplants. And we have actually met him. He says that they were the very best of friends, and he had lots of other memories to share. This is Dagobert right after the war. He's just entered the DP camp, and this was actually the photo that they used for his DP camp ID. This is the weapons factory, the gun factory, where he was enslaved, and he was going there on that morning that he was miraculously tipped off, don't go into work, the Nazis are loading all the Jews onto trucks. This building still exists. My husband and I took our kids and were able to visit it. This is that wonderful Catholic couple that hid him off and on, Annie and Alex Kozitsky. And this is my husband and I and 3 of our daughters on that trip in 2016 when we took our girls to try to walk in the footsteps of their papa. This is these are the remnants of the train station from which he stole that Gestapo car in hopes of fleeing to Switzerland. And this is the very courtyard that the Allies bombed and in which he found that piece of lead pipe in the rubble that he then used to make a key to escape the Gestapo prison. This was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. When we were with our kids visiting the hospital, I asked around and asked if anyone knew anything about the history of the hospital. And one of the man here actually is a hospital employee who, as a hobby, that history is something that he loves to research. He heard our story, and he was able to take our family through the very tunnels in the basement of the hospital through which Bert escaped after he opened that gate with the key that he made. These are tunnels underground that they're not very stable, so no one's allowed in them, but they made the exception for us, and it was absolutely incredible. Okay, this is me back just in February of 2019, right before COVID shut the world down. I actually went back to Berlin to do some more research, and I was able to go and visit that apartment building, the same Nazi district headquarters apartment where the Russians barged in and almost killed them. This is Ilse. My husband and I actually were able to go and visit her back in 1999 at her home outside of London. She was absolutely warm and delightful, and she shared with my husband and I that she really had loved him. You know, can you imagine having someone's child and they don't remember you? So I give her a lot of credit for being able to understand, why that happened, and she was really lovely. And this is a picture of their baby's grave. She had named him God. My father-in-law did not get a chance to meet him. She was pregnant when they were all captured together, and she and her son having nothing to do with my father-in-law, but he was a little boy. They were both sent off to Bergen-Belsen, where the baby God was born, and he lived for about 5 months and then died of typhus. And Ilse eventually came to the United States to visit her friend, Mrs. Fink, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law went to meet her. And so this is a picture of Ilse in the middle. My mother-in-law is on the right-hand side, and then the famous Mrs. Fink is on the left. They also took a picture of my father-in-law in the middle, and then Ilse on one side and my mother-in-law on the other. And the ladies exclaimed, "Bert and his 2 wives." But sadly, my mother-in-law can't find that photo, so I can't show it to you. And this is a picture of my father-in-law on his last visit to Jerusalem. He died in January of 2016. May his memory be a blessing. He was thrilled, though, that the first edition of the book came out in 2001. This is it. And it was translated into German for German school children. I actually found this copy in a library in Berlin. And he loved speaking at universities and schools, and here he is speaking at Emory, here in Atlanta. And a few years ago, I don't know if any of you have been to Germany and have seen all the little brass plaques on the sidewalks. There's a non-Jewish artist who decided he wanted to do something to commemorate the victims of the Nazi terror. And so they do a heck of a lot of research to make sure they have everything accurate. And then he puts a brass plaque for each of the victims in front of the address where they last lived. So this is taken right after he laid these 3 brass plaques right in front of where my father-in-law's apartment was. And then on the left is me a few years later, back in February of 2019, visiting those same plaques in that same location. Okay, now to our blockbuster possible news. So when the newest edition of the book came out in March of 2019, we did the latest thing, which is we created a website, right? So my nephew created the website, and my mother-in-law handed him a box of photos and documents for him to scan and upload. So he scans and uploads a document that I have never seen before. And this is it. And this document was completely shocking. Why? Because it's a document written in my father-in-law's handwriting, obviously by him, back in either 1946 or 1947 when he was in the DP camp of Feldafing, just outside of Munich. And it's a timeline, it appears to be a timeline of his time during the war. And what is so shocking? If you can look at that arrow is pointing to the name Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen is a concentration camp just outside of Berlin. Now, my father-in-law had always said that he was never, ever in a concentration camp. So this was completely shocking. Next to it, this also mentions the name of a block elder at Sachsenhausen. It mentions that he wore civilian clothes, and it mentions that he worked with dogs. So, as I said, completely shocking because he had never mentioned any of this, never shown me this document. And so this is what prompted my trip in February of 2019 back to Berlin to do some more research. So I went to Sachsenhausen, and I met with their researcher, and we searched through all of their files for his name, for anything that resembled his name, for anything at all that we could find. Here's what we discovered. There were inmates that did wear civilian clothes towards the end of the war. Why? Because the Nazis ran out of the fabric, the striped uniform fabric. So that was entirely possible. There was a unit there that worked with dogs, so that was entirely possible. But they had no mention of his name. So we really don't know. And then also, top left, I went to that same Berlin government archive to see if the documents that he wrote out much closer to the war, if any of them mentioned Sachsenhausen. Most of the people who survived the war had to fill out long forms explaining what had happened to them in order to receive restitution from the German government. He did not mention a single thing about Sachsenhausen in them, and that was quite strange because he would have gotten more money if he had. So it will remain a mystery. We just don't know. It's possible that somehow when he was on the run, he was there, he worked with the dog unit, that something happened, but virtually nobody ever escaped from Sachsenhausen. So they really don't think, that it makes a lot of sense that he was a prisoner, but we'll probably never know. So thank you so much for coming to the talk, and I'm so happy to take questions. They were married before he went into hiding, yes. Yes, just a little bit before. And the reason that they married, as she explained, she worked as a nurse in the Jewish hospital. And there were many crazy things about the Nazis, but one of the crazy things was that before they shipped you off to a concentration camp to kill you, they wanted you to be pretty healthy. So if you were sick, they would put you in the Jewish hospital. So they kept the Jewish hospital up and running with nurses and doctors throughout the war, through the entire war. So she had been a nurse there, but at a certain point, they decided they were going to start deporting nurses and doctors who worked there because they didn't need as many. And they had a hierarchy about how they did that. And if you were married, for some reason, they didn't deport you as early. They would deport single nurses and doctors first. So she said, basically that they talked about it, and he married her to try to save her life, because if she were married, she'd have higher status. Now, as it turned out, they were both picked up, and so she also saved him because of the fact that she had, that security as working at the Jewish hospital. So it was definitely not a marriage like what we would hope for today, that we're in love, let's spend the rest of our life together. It was to help each other. But yes, so that's why. Yes, she did. He just did not. He only remembered that soon after he went underground, he had a very vivid memory that he lived for about 6 weeks in this awful drunkard's apartment. And he remembered that Ilse and Ilse's son Klaus, they were with him at the time. But after that, he didn't remember anything about her until the end of the war, until we found her and discovered all this. So, and even after he talked to her, those memories really didn't come back for him. They really were gone. Yes? Klaus was Ilse's son. Ilse had been a single mom, and so he was like 3 or 4, at the beginning, and so he was there. And then he actually went and lived with that lovely Catholic couple. They wanted to help a child, and so that is, as it turns out, how he even came to meet them. He survived the war. He grew up. He lived in England. He had a family. I've read his papers that he wrote, when he was trying to get restitution from the German government, and they're very sad. He talks about his stepfather. He called him his stepfather. He talks about how his he basically had almost no education, and so he really struggled to make his way in the world because of that. But he did live, and he has children and grandchildren now. Sadly, both he and Ilse passed away soon before my father-in-law passed away. Yes. Yeah, so after the war, she made sure that there was actually a gravestone for him, and so she shared that photograph with Bert. Yes? It is, yes, because the latest edition just came out in 2019. So it's available wherever books are sold. If they don't carry it, you can ask for it. If you happen to be going on Amazon, though, make sure you get the black cover of the book. The white cover is the older version from 2001, and it doesn't have all the updates in it. So, all right, anything else? Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody.
Start each day meaningfully. Click subscribe and hit the notification bell below for videos just like this.